Hello, this is Soul Symbols, and I'm Karen Sullivan. And today I'm going to be looking at overall arch of July. I'm not going to go into massive detail. I'm just going to give you the arc, and I'm doing it on the hottest day of the year. Absolutely melting here. So yeah, doing it very early in the morning in the hopes I don't completely melt on camera. Okay, so July is opening with one of the most charged configurations of the year. We have Mars meeting Uranus in Gemini. So that's an aspect of sudden movement, disruption with Uranus here. There can be invention and change, but I want to look beyond the possibility of that single event, which could be a very disruptive start to July. So when Mars and Uranus come together in Gemini, I was looking at the routes through which the world moves and how they can become highly active. The transport, trade, information, energy, airspace, the shipping routes and communications and those networks, the things that connect us to one another, almost like the world's nervous system. And when I trace this particular conjunction back through history, there were striking patterns emerging that they're rhymes, they're not complete repetitions, they're similar in nature. But it's when the world's systems of movement, fuel, communication, and power were being reshaped, and when their vulnerabilities were suddenly revealed. So, in this video, I want to explore Mars and Uranus in Gemini in the context of 1859 and 1943. The last two conjunctions in Gemini of Mars and Uranus, and that pressure that I saw in those historical looks around our present day roots and energy systems. But I want to look at the much wider possibility that's held by the outer planets throughout July. They are in the most beautiful configuration and it looks very fortuitous. So although there's that disruption, the sky is giving us a beautiful promise there. So July is containing a pattern that personally I think it's worth approaching through history, but I'm not going to be predicting in the literal sense. I don't think history repeats itself exactly, but there's a certain way that those themes reoccur. They mutate and find their expression in a different world. So at the beginning of the month, Mars joins with Uranus around 4 degrees of Gemini. So Mars is bringing heat and urgency, conflict, action, momentum. It's the warrior planet. And Uranus is bringing us disruption, acceleration, rebellion, but also innovation and maybe an unexpected turn, given this later configuration in the sky that's building at the beginning of July. Gemini speaks of routes ruled by Mercury, so it's the routes through which things move, basically, not just our thoughts, but roads, railways, ships, airspace, trade information, and that messaging, data, borders, networks, and the nervous system of collective life in a metaphorical way. So one of the questions moving through July could be about what happens when the routes the world moves through, that trade moves through, that we move through, comes under pressure. So I had a look at the conjunction in 1859 when Mars and Uranus also met in early Gemini. And I was looking at the historical field around that moment, and it's quite astonishing. I don't normally do the general world mundane astrology, but I feel there's a need to, because I feel we're at a turning point right now, a global turning point. So one of the first things I noticed was construction began at the Suez Canal in 1859. So that was more than just an engineering project. It was an attempt to redraw the movement of goods, empire, I figure strongly now, people and power across the globe. And at the same time, The Second Italian War of Independence was underway, and railways were becoming crucial to military mobilization. France moved vast numbers of troops by rail into northern Italy during this period. And it showed me, I was looking at how quickly warfare could now travel through a new transport network. It will become apparent why I'm mentioning Italy and the transport routes and the war. And later that year, Edwin Drake struck oil in Pennsylvania, but that's not the first time oil had ever been found. But the important thing about this is it became a foundation point for the commercial oil industry in the US. And that is so important because oil would go on to power so much of the transport industry, warfare, and economic life of the modern world. There's also a story in there in this year about the SS Great Eastern, and it's part of the atmosphere of these routes and transport. It was launched in 1958, but I want to be precise about that, but its sea trials in 1859 carried the same symbolic charge. So it was an immense, unprecedented, a ship built at a scale the world had barely imagined before. So it held the ambition of a new era of transport, greater reach, greater speed, greater capacity to transport goods and people around the world. And then within that same year, we see the shadow side of that emerging world of connection. The Royal Charter storm devastated shipping around Britain. The Carrington event struck the telegraph system and it produced electrical surges, very much Uranus, disruption, Uranus, and even fires in stations. So there was that new global nervous system beginning to form, and suddenly the fragility is being exposed here through that Royal Charter storm and the Carrington events. You can't beat nature. You can't overpower nature. So why am I telling you this? Well, 1859, we're not talking just about a story of technological breakthrough. It's the emergence of an energy, transport and communications complex, which affects us to this day. So rail, canal, oil, giant ships, telegraphy, telegraph, all forms of circulation expanding at one time. And alongside that expansion, there's a realization that these systems can become vulnerable, interrupted, or overwhelmed here. And if we move forward to the next conjunction in 1943, there's this pattern expanded, okay? It's different, but it's still there. And Italy, again, becomes a striking point of resonance in 1943. The first conjunction of Uranus and Mars was on the 9th of September 1943. So it's immediately after the Italian armistice was announced. And on the day of the Allied landings at Salerno, I hope I pronounced that, Germany had moved quickly to occupy Italy. And then there was a brutal struggle over a peninsula that had become a corridor. It was a place of invasion. Shifting alliances were happening. There was air power, communication, again, the supply lines, military movement and control of passage. What's different from the previous conjunction is this was more about war. So, war of the empires, okay? Empire was building global connections that first time, and now they're in wars, basically. But I'm not saying that because Italy featured in both of those conjunctions, it has to be Italy again. I'm looking at the symbolic rhyme around contested corridors and that strategic geography. So the movement of armies, control of routes, and the way a particular landscape gets charged because of where it's sitting in the wider global system. And particularly in this wartime conjunction, we were looking at the air. the innovation. Uranus brings that innovation. And there was a plane called the Gloucester Meteor, and it flew earlier that year in, where's the date? Yeah, March 1943. But it doesn't fall exactly on that Mars-Uranus conjunction. And really, it belongs strongly to the Uranus in Gemini. The development of jet fight, radical new speed, movement through the air, it's a very different future for aviation here. And we can attribute this probably more to the Uranus in Gemini as it moved through. And we have that right at the beginning of Gemini now. So when I'm looking at July 2026, I think that Mars-Uranus conjunction is asking us to pay attention. That's why I'm bringing these things up, to pay attention to the world's circulation systems. I'm not saying there's going to be a particular disaster, but it's obvious at the moment that these systems are under enormous pressure as I speak, as we enter July. The Strait of Hormuz is offering a really clear contemporary image when we think of those corridors and contested corridors. Suez Canal, that was an engineered passage, and it was engineered so global trade could move. Hormuz is a natural maritime choke point. That's Iran, if you don't know. If you haven't heard, you're going to be listening to things if you haven't heard. But it's a maritime choke point. But they're both places, that Suez and Hormuz are both places where energy and military conflict, trade and shipping, the movement of goods around the world, and political power and civilian life meet. So at the moment, the movement of oil through a route like Hormuz is disrupted. It's threatened or made more expensive. And those effects are not going to remain in one place. They move outward through oil prices to begin with, and then there's shipping insurance, freight, petrol, diesel. There's the farming costs, food distribution, and the cost of our everyday shopping. So the route becomes visible because the pressure in it travels through that whole system. That's why I'm looking at it metaphorically as a nervous system. So if there's pressure in one point, it's going to affect the whole system. But I'm also really aware, as I talk about the Strait of Hormuz, about the violence and devastation, the grief unfolding across Gaza, Lebanon, and that wider region of West Asia. I don't want them to become symbols for us to consume. They're human realities. They've got history, causes, losses, and states of their own, okay? So this astrology is not going to explain them away. I just felt I really needed to say that because I'm so aware of the suffering there. But also what we can look at with this Uranus in Gemini and the Mars conjuncting is this global protest movement connected with those situations out West Asia, Middle East. It's a rapid movement of witness. We've got hideous images and testimony. There's grief and solidarity through networks. And that's speaking to the larger Gemini Aquarius atmosphere. So what is happening in one place, it's over there somewhere. It doesn't remain contained there. It's traveling through a new network now, through our phones and platforms, through the streets, the communities, and our collective consciousness. So information itself becomes that root of power, and that's been really contested. There's been certain governments that are trying to restrict that flow of proper information. Yeah. So Mars conjunct Uranus is like a spark to all this, but that is not the whole story of July. It's different. Behind it is a much wider generational configuration. Uranus in Gemini is trine to Pluto in Aquarius, Neptune in Aries sextile both Uranus and Pluto. So these are the slower planets, the outer planets, and they shape the larger collective field around technology, imagination, ideology, our networks and power, the collective organization, and this future we're trying to build. And these outer planets have been connected for some time, but there is something stunning about that aspect in the sky. And because it's generational, it's forging something. So we have Leo here entering Leo, and that's going to activate the whole of those aspects. So by 11th of July, Jupiter in early Leo is opposing Pluto in Aquarius, and it's in the midst of trine in Neptune in Aries and sextile in that Uranus in Gemini. So it's a very particular aspect that's going on here. It looks like it's been called the basket by astrologer S.J. Anderson, but it's a cradle, so it's an opposition held inside two trines and two sextiles. And you know, call it a basket or a cradle, for me, symbolically, it's going to hold something. And they are very benefic aspects. The hard aspect is that opposition between Jupiter and Pluto to do with power. So that's not a soft, that really isn't a soft, that the rest of it is beautiful. Trines are the nature of Jupiter and sextiles the nature of Venus, the benefics. But this is an opposition nature of Saturn, okay? So this can magnify questions of leadership, wealth, influence, power. It can magnify public authority and control of the future. We got Aquarius, which is about the the structure to a degree, the looking back, but also the looking forward. It's ruled by Saturn, and Pluto's there, which brings up questions of power and wealth and what's going on under the surface here. So Leo is about, in the mundane, who's leading. It's the temple of the sun, who's visible, and the story that dominates and where people are placing their confidence. And Aquarius will be looking more to who is holding the network of things, controlling the system, how those resources are distributed, and what does the collective need. But that tension with these other beautiful aspects is being held within, for me, that's a larger field of possibility. This aspect was first pointed out by André Barbault, and he saw this broader harmonious configuration and aspect as deeply constructive. He even spoke of it as potentially working towards, I'll quote him, a splendid relaunch of civilization. It's a huge phrase, and it doesn't fit our times, which is why I'm bringing both sides to this for reflection. Barbault was also the person who predicted the pandemic of the early 2020s. So he's got a lot of credibility. He was a very good, thorough astrologer. But that supportive aspect, it doesn't mean that, we can justify the suffering that's going on by this future promise. But what it is suggesting is a generational shake-up that can become generative. And we often lose our hope, don't we, with the hideousness of what's going on around the world at the moment and all the various crises. So there could be a crisis in the roots, as I said, through which our world moves. And it can reveal where our systems, given the other conjunctions and what was happening historically, what the pattern seems to be, are new systems, and then looking at where those systems are brittle and extractive, or where they're unjust and unable to carry the weight that's been placed on them. So I'm thinking empire, the vessel of empire. If you think of the blood vessels and everything streaming, it's kind of, for me, it's we're in something like that. Mm, yeah. But that weight on those roots, and the pressure can create the conditions for new thinking. It can bring a more resilient energy system or different transport structures. So we may see further innovations or new technology emerging throughout July, and a stronger public infrastructure and new forms of collective responsibility. And this is not going to happen in July, but I think we've been building to it for so long. There's been those aspects in the sky for quite some time, and they're going to stay there for quite some time. They're very slow moving, but we're at a trigger point. It's like, it's time to begin, guys. Okay. So as I say, that sextile, in traditional astrology, has got the quality of Venus. So we're talking the sextiles, connection, exchange, relationship. So it's a joining of the things that can work together, that harmonious aspect. And the trine, as I said, has got that quality of Jupiter. So we're looking at growth and confidence. We're looking at opportunity, the capacity for life to move freely, to broaden, to expand. So these outer planets, sextiles and trines, that they're not removing the difficulty, but they're creating pathways through it. For me, that's how I see it. I don't see anything unless, the Martians land and take everyone's focus away. It's not going to happen, is it? It's going to be gradual. The Mars and Uranus in the early July are going to bring that jolt to us. There's going to be sudden acceleration, technological disruption, perhaps sharp turn in the public narrative. That's what we're hoping for. There's going to be conflicts around movement. There has been for some time, and also around the information trade or communication. We may see more of those at the beginning of July. But then when we have this Jupiter coming into aspect with all those outer planets, that's going to enlarge the story. So what maybe begins as a very local issue can become public, political. It can become international and economic very quick. And I believe we're in political and economic global crisis right now. So it's likely to. So later in the month, the sun is going to enter Leo, and that's going to trigger that same aspect of those outer planets, that pattern. So for me, the sun is going to bring that visibility, and that is going to be on leadership, government. So we might have public declarations, we may have an upsurge or a visibility of corporate power, national confidence, and competing versions of the future are going to move to the foreground here. There's going to be a visibility in all those narratives. And then at the end of July, we're going to reach a real concentration point. So here, the sun meets Jupiter in a Leo Cazimi, and the full moon is going to fall in Aquarius right close to Pluto. And at the same time, you can see here Mars in Gemini is squaring Venus in Virgo. That's a lot going on. So for me, that's feeling like a movement when something is illuminated publicly. So around this time, we might have an announcement or a leadership decision. We may see a political or technological narrative. I mean, they've been emerging for some time, about digital ID, about the AI, all those things. But there's going to be something very visible and very large that we can't miss. So there might be a major claim of authority or that collective realization about the systems we're actually living within. I don't think this is going to be quiet. It's going to be visible, big and loud. It's the sun and Jupiter. But then when we look at that Mars square Venus, this is not going to be abstract or over there or out there, okay? Gemini is asking for speed and movement, information and rapid response. And Venus in Virgo is going to be looking at the material realities. So the cost, the labour needed, food, health, maintenance, efficiency. So it's the practical limits of a system and who's doing the work of keeping things going. So we've got that speed, movement and information, and we've got the details and the practicalities of that. So Mercury as ruler of Gemini is extremely important. Its retrograde movement through Cancer is asking us to revisit questions of homeland, safety, belonging, emotional memory. So it's the stories we're telling ourselves about what protects us, and that can be those collective narratives there as well. You know, what is protection and security. This could be a story that comes up about national security as by way of waging wars and taking other people's resources, basically, is no nice way to put it. So Mercury's going to turn direct here in late July, and so the things that have been under review can begin to move forward again here. But I believe there's going to be a clearer awareness of the things that we've overlooked here. So for me, the heart of July is the roots are under pressure. So those systems that connect the world, the energy trade, transport, food, information, communication. So witness and collective movement. We're not going to be able to take those for granted, I don't think, during July. When there's any change, there's pressure that brings that change, okay? So I think that Mars and Uranus can reveal the fault line. Jupiter and the Sun in Leo can make that really visible. But that Pluto in Aquarius is going to keep bringing us back to the deeper question of who holds the power within the network. And that beautiful cradle basket pattern is saying that that disruption may also contain the seed of a different future for us. So the question in July for us is how we respond. Is that going to be through fear? And I'm not talking you individually, I'm looking collectively, including that dratted leadership, okay? So are we going to respond through fear, escalation and control there? Or is that pressure showing us where a more intelligent, humane and resilient way of organising collective life is being asked for now? So I don't think July is asking us to predict that single outcome, but pay attention to those roots that are under pressure. If you hear about movement restricted, wars, conflict, resource grabs, or you know, not just literal, but in the networks, in how we communicate. So those roots of energy and trade, keep an eye on them this month. So the transport and food and any routes where the information or our sense of collective grief and protest, but also the propaganda. Watch for the propaganda. We're talking Gemini here, so this can be propaganda. Okay, so use your critical thinking faculties, but also our witness and collective feeling, how that is moving across the world. So the global protests have been a feature for a couple of years. I think they will escalate. They will continue. The people, you know, we've got the Pluto and moon signature in Aquarius is the people and the power in the collective field. So we have a great point there where we can make ourselves heard, maybe move or suppress some of the more violent things that our governments are basically carrying out. Okay. So Mars and Uranus in Gemini conjunct that system. I've already said it, and they can expose what's fragile, overstretched, or just not fit for the world that we're living in or we want to live in. And those reflections are back on the 1859 and the 1943 conjunctions. We got echoes of it there. But the wider planetary pattern is suggesting that the disruption is probably part of a larger reorganization. So a movement in which new ways of connecting, moving, communicating, sharing responsibility can emerge here. Okay, the question's not simply what breaks open, it's what becomes possible once we can't ignore where the old systems are failing to hold us. So that's what I have for you. Thank you so much for being here. I'd love some good old Gemini communication through the internet. You know, what themes are you noticing in the world around you, but also within your own chart as July unfolds? Come back to the astrology. And obviously, if it resonated with you, and please like, subscribe, share, do the comment, and I'd love to build the community here. But I also want to say thank you to the new subscribers. You're very welcome here. I don't normally focus on the mundane as a whole piece, but this July absolutely called for it. Okay. And I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.